The True Path to Manifestation. Introduction. You are not failing at manifestation, you are succeeding at it, completely, consistently, without a single day off. The results in your life right now are not the absence of manifestation working. They are manifesting exactly as it always that level. Here is where most people's relationship with this teaching ends before it begins. They hear, you attract what you assume, and they think, fine, I will assume better things. I will tell myself I am worthy. I will affirm that money comes easily. I will say the sentences that belong to the version of me I want to become. And then they feel, somewhere underneath all that, a soft, persistent laughter. The kind that knows you. Because the assumption they are trying to change is not a thought they are having. It is a conclusion they reached about themselves somewhere in the past, and then forgot they reached, and then began living as though it was simply true. You don't know you're assuming you're the kind of person life eventually disappoints. It doesn't feel like an assumption. It feels like experience. It feels like evidence. It feels like realism. But it is an assumption. It was chosen once, even if not consciously. It was reinforced by events you interpreted in a particular way. It became a lens, and now you see everything through it, including the techniques you try, including the results you allow, including the moments you get close to something different and then, at the last second, find a way back to what feels familiar. Familiar is not the same as true. Familiar is just what your nervous system has learned to expect. There is a particular cruelty in partial understanding. If you had never heard of manifestation, you would simply live your life, driven by assumptions you never examined, shaped by a story you never questioned. That would be its own kind of limitation, but at least it would not include blame. Partial understanding adds blame. You have heard enough to believe you should be able to change your results. You have not heard enough to understand why you haven't. And so the gap between what you know and what you're living produces a very specific kind of suffering. The feeling that everyone else seems to be doing this correctly, that the law works for them, that you must be broken in some specific way that no technique can quite reach. You are not broken. You are working with an incomplete map. This audiobook is the part of the map that was missing. What we are going to do here is not complicated, but it is not comfortable either. Comfortable is what you have already tried. We are going to go directly to the foundation, to the assumptions that have been quietly building the life you have, and we are going to examine them with enough honesty that they lose their invisibility. Because an assumption you can see is an assumption you can change. It is only the ones you cannot see that run the show. We are going to look at what Neville actually taught, not the softened version, but the full weight of it, and we are going to understand why it is, in fact, the most compassionate framework available. Not compassionate in the way that tells you everything is fine, compassionate in the way that tells you the truth, because the truth is the only thing that actually helps. We are going to understand what happens in the gap between choosing a new assumption and seeing it appear in your physical reality. Why that gap exists, what it contains, how to move through it without losing the thread of what you chose. We are going to understand imagination not as daydreaming, but as a precise tool, the way Neville intended it, for rehearsing an end until it stops feeling like a wish and starts feeling like a memory of something that has already happened. And we are going to understand what it means to move, to take action not from the person you used to be, but from the person you have decided to become, so that your life does not just carry a new thought on top of old behavior, but begins to be built, piece by piece, from the inside out. By the end of this, I don't want you to believe in the law of assumption. Belief is fragile. Belief requires maintenance. Belief collapses under pressure. What I want is something harder to shake than belief. I want you to recognize the law, to see it operating in your own history, clearly, specifically, without doubt, in the results that have followed you across different circumstances, different places, different attempts to change. I want you to look at your life and see the assumption that built it, the way you might finally see a pattern in a piece of music you had been hearing wrong for years. Because recognition is different from belief. Recognition doesn't require faith. It requires only that you look honestly at what has already happened. And when you recognize it, when you see exactly how your assumptions have been building your experience with total consistency and total fidelity, the next thought arrives on its own. It is not inspiring, it is simply logical. If my assumptions built all of this without my knowing it, what becomes possible when I finally choose them on purpose? That question is where this audiobook begins, not with hope, not with motivation, with understanding. Chapter 1. What an assumption actually is. There is a word we use constantly without examining what it means: assumption. We use it to mean a guess, a provisional thought, something we hold loosely, aware that we might be wrong, ready to revise when new information arrives. That is not what Neville meant, and that is not what is running your life. The assumptions that shape your experience are not guesses. They are not tentative. They do not feel like assumptions at all. They feel like observations, like simple, accurate descriptions of how things are. Specifically, how things are for you. You don't assume you're the kind of person who struggles with money. You know it. You have the evidence. You have the history. You have the pattern across years and circumstances and attempts to change. The same outcome arriving in slightly different clothes, confirming the same quiet conclusion every time. That is what makes these assumptions so difficult to reach. A guess you can question. An observation feels like it would be dishonest to question. So you don't question it. You work around it. You try techniques that sit on top of it. You build a practice of positive thinking over a foundation that has not moved. And then you wonder why the structure keeps collapsing. Neville Goddard made a distinction that most of his interpreters miss. He was not talking about conscious assumptions, the ones you can name, examine, and decide to change in an afternoon. He was talking about the assumptions that have become part of the fabric of your identity, the ones so thoroughly integrated into how you see yourself that they stopped being ideas you held and became the lens through which you hold everything else. There is a difference between thinking, "I am not very lucky," and living from the assumption that luck is simply not your portion. The first is a thought. You can notice a thought. You can argue with it, replace it, or watch it pass. The second is a ground. You cannot notice the ground you are standing on because noticing requires distance, and you have no distance from it. You are not looking at the assumption, you are looking through it, at everything. This is why changing your thoughts, genuinely, effortfully, with the best intention, often produces so little change in your circumstances. The thoughts sit above the ground. The ground doesn't move. Let me be precise about what an assumption at this level actually contains. It contains a prediction, not a conscious one, an automatic one, a quiet, instantaneous forecast that runs beneath every new situation you enter, telling you, before anything has happened, what kind of thing is likely to happen. What the person across from you is probably thinking, whether this opportunity is the kind that works out or the kind that almost works out and then doesn't. Whether you are the kind of person this is for. You feel this forecast as intuition, as reading a room, as being realistic. It is your assumption, meeting each new situation before you do, and pre-interpreting it in line with what it already believes. It also contains a filter. Once the assumption has made its forecast, it filters incoming information to confirm itself. This is not a character flaw, it is how the mind works. A feature, not a malfunction. The mind is constantly flooded with more information than it can process. To function, it selects. It prioritizes what confirms the patterns it has already built. It passes over what contradicts them, or reinterprets contradictory information until it fits. This means that evidence against your assumption is arriving constantly. You are not seeing it, or you are seeing it and immediately explaining it away, as a coincidence, as temporary, as something that doesn't quite count, as something that happened to someone else in circumstances that don't really apply to you. The person who assumes they are fundamentally unloved does not notice the small, quiet gestures of care that arrive regularly in their life. They are not lying when they say they feel unloved. They are telling the precise truth of their filtered experience. And the filter was built by the assumption. The assumption built the filter. The filter selected the evidence. The evidence confirmed the assumption. The assumption deepened. This is the loop, and it runs for most people without a single moment of conscious participation. It also contains a behavioral instruction. This is where the assumption reaches out of the inner world and begins directly constructing the outer one. Because you do not just perceive from your assumption, you move from it. The person who assumes they will eventually be abandoned does not wait passively to see whether abandonment arrives. They move in ways that make abandonment more likely, pulling away before someone can leave, testing in ways that exhaust the people who intended to stay, choosing partners whose limitations make eventual departure nearly inevitable, interpreting normal distance as the beginning of the end, and responding in ways that confirm that interpretation. None of this is conscious. None of this is chosen in the ordinary sense. It is the behavioral expression of a belief so deep it functions as instruction. The person who assumes they are not the kind of person serious opportunities choose does not simply fail to receive opportunities. They hesitate at the moment of application. They undersell in the moment of presentation. They choose slightly beneath their capability, because choosing at the full level would require stepping into an identity the assumption hasn't authorized. And when the result comes back smaller than it could have been, the assumption nods. See, this is how it goes for me. It does not know it created the result it is now using as evidence. This is what Neville meant when he said, "Your world is yourself pushed out." Not metaphorically, not as a poetic description of your attitude. Literally. Your assumptions about who you are, the forecast, the filter, the behavioral instruction, push outward into the physical world and construct the experience you then live inside of and call reality. The relationship you are in right now is, to a significant degree, a materialization of your assumptions about what you are the kind of person who receives in love. The financial situation you are navigating right now is, to a significant degree, a materialization of your assumptions about what you are the kind of person who is allowed to hold, to build, to keep. The professional reality you inhabit right now is, to a significant degree, a materialization of your assumptions about what you are the kind of person whose work the world takes seriously. This is not blame. This is mechanism. Understanding a mechanism is not the same as being blamed for its output. A person who didn't know water boils at a specific temperature is not blamed for their soup being cold. They simply didn't understand what was governing the result. Once they understand, they can change it. You are not being blamed for the assumptions you developed without knowing you were developing them. Most of them were formed in circumstances where you had no framework for understanding what was happening. You were young, or you were afraid, or you were simply living inside an environment that modeled a particular kind of expectation, and you absorbed it the way all living things absorb their environment, without resistance, without examination, without... The assumption is not your fault, but it is your responsibility now, because now you know what it is. Now you have a name for the mechanism, and a mechanism you can name is a mechanism you can work with. There is one more thing an assumption contains that is rarely discussed. It contains a sense of home. This is the piece that makes change genuinely difficult, not intellectually but viscerally. Because even when an assumption is producing results you consciously hate, it is familiar. And the nervous system, at a level far below your preferences, prioritizes familiarity over happiness. Familiar feels safe. Not good, safe. These are not the same thing. The assumption that you are the kind of person who struggles has produced a life you would not choose. But it is a life the body knows. It is a life the nervous system can predict. And prediction, even of difficulty, is experienced as a form of control. When you try to step into a genuinely different assumption, the body resists. Not because the new assumption is wrong, because it is unfamiliar, because it cannot yet be predicted, because safety, to a nervous system trained on the old story, means the old story, regardless of what it has cost you. This is why willpower alone cannot change an assumption at the deepest level. Willpower is conscious. The assumption lives beneath consciousness. You cannot overpower something you cannot fully see with a tool that operates only at the surface. What you need is something different, not force, familiarity. You need to make the new assumption feel like home, not through repetition of words, but through repeated experience of the state. Through imagination precise enough to give the nervous system new data, through movement aligned enough with the new identity that the body... That is the full practice. And it begins not with technique, but with seeing the assumption clearly enough to stop letting it hide. So before anything else, before choosing a new assumption, before learning the imagination practice, before any of the work that follows, there is this: the willingness to look at what is actually running, not at what you wish were running, not at the version of yourself you present to the world, or even the version you present to yourself in your better moments. What is actually, quietly, persistently running? The sentence underneath everything else, the one that, if you sit with real honesty, completes this phrase. I am the kind of person who... You know how it ends. You have always known. That sentence is where the work begins, and in the next chapter, we are going to look at what that sentence has already built, and why that is, despite everything, the most useful place to start. Chapter 2. Your current reality is a receipt, not a sentence. Look at your life right now, not the life you are building toward, not the life you believe you are capable of, not the life you would describe if someone asked what you are working on, the life that is actually here, today, in its current form. The numbers in your account, the quality of your closest relationships, the work you are doing and whether it feels like expression or like endurance. The way you move through a day, whether there is ease underneath the busyness or whether there is a low, persistent tension that you have learned to call normal. Look at it plainly, without the story that explains why it looks the way it does, without the context that makes it temporary, the exceptions that make it survivable, the comparisons that make it acceptable. Just the bare fact of it. Now here is the question Neville's work forces you to ask. Who assumed this into existence? Most people, when their life doesn't look the way they want, do one of two things. They blame themselves. They decide they are not disciplined enough, not consistent enough, not positive enough, not worthy enough. They treat the gap between where they are and where they want to be as evidence of a personal deficiency, something wrong in them that needs to be corrected before the life they want is permitted to arrive. Or they blame circumstance, the economy, their upbringing, the people who didn't come through, the timing that was never quite right. They place the cause of their results entirely outside themselves, in a world that has conspired or simply failed to give them what they needed. Both positions feel true from the inside. Both are incomplete. Neville's framework offers a third position, one that is harder to accept than either blame or excuse, because it requires something more uncomfortable than guilt and more demanding than resignation. It requires you to see your current reality as information, not as punishment, not an accident, as information, specifically as a receipt, A receipt is a record of a transaction that has already occurred. You do not argue with a receipt. You do not feel guilty about a receipt. You do not look at a receipt and conclude that you are a bad person. You simply read it, clearly, without emotion, as an accurate record of what was exchanged. Your current reality is a receipt for the assumptions you have been holding, every detail of it. The financial number is not random. It sits at approximately the level your deepest assumptions consider normal for someone like you, not necessarily comfortable, but familiar, expected, the kind of number that confirms the story without being so catastrophic that it forces a complete collapse. The relationship dynamic is not a coincidence. It expresses with remarkable fidelity what your assumptions believe you are the kind of person who receives in intimacy. The degree of security, the quality of attention, the amount of effort the other person makes, the distance that persists even in closeness. The professional situation is not simply the result of your skills or your opportunities or your luck. It reflects quite precisely the level at which your assumptions have authorized you to operate, the ceiling they have installed not in the world, but in you, in the moment of hesitation before you speak, in the choice that felt realistic at the time, in the version of yourself you offered when something larger was available. This is not comfortable to read. It is not meant to be. But comfort and usefulness are not the same thing. Here is what makes the receipt metaphor genuinely liberating rather than simply accurate. A receipt is a record of the past. It tells you nothing definitive about what the next transaction will be. You look at a receipt and you see what has already been exchanged. You do not look at a receipt and conclude that all future exchanges are predetermined. The receipt has no authority over what comes next. It only records what has already come. This is the move that most people miss when they look honestly at their results. They look, they see the pattern, they feel the weight of its consistency, and they conclude that the pattern is permanent. That its persistence across years and circumstances is evidence of something fixed about them, something that does not change regardless of what they try. That conclusion is itself an assumption, and it is arguably the most dangerous one, because it takes the receipt, which is simply a record, and promotes it to a sentence, a verdict, a declaration of what is possible for this particular person in this particular life. A sentence forecloses, a receipt simply records. The difference between those two readings of your current reality is the difference between a life that repeats and a life that changes. Let me be precise about what the receipt is actually recording. It is not recording your effort. You may have worked very hard. The receipt does not measure effort. It is not recording your intentions. You may have wanted something better for a long time. The receipt does not measure wanting. It is not recording your potential. You may be capable of far more than your current results suggest. The receipt has no access to potential. It records one thing only: the assumption that was dominant, not in your conscious mind, but at the level of identity, during the period that produced these results. That is the only variable it tracks, which means that when you change that variable, genuinely, at the level of identity rather than the level of conscious thought, the receipt changes. Not immediately, not without the lag that exists between a new assumption and its materialization in the physical world. But inevitably, a different assumption produces a different receipt. This is not a promise. It is the logic of the mechanism. There is a particular feature of the receipt that deserves careful attention. It tends to be consistent across domains that seem unrelated. The person who experiences persistent financial struggle often also experiences a particular kind of relational dynamic, one in which they give more than they receive, in which their needs are treated as secondary, in which asking for what they want feels dangerous or shameful. The person who cannot seem to be fully seen in their work often also experiences a particular kind of social invisibility, the sense of being present in a room without quite landing in it, of contributing without being credited, of being liked without being truly known. Here is what makes the receipt metaphor genuinely liberating rather than simply accurate. A receipt is a record of the past. It tells you nothing definitive about what the next transaction will be. You look at a receipt and you see what has already been exchanged. You do not look at a receipt and conclude that all future exchanges are predetermined. The receipt has no authority over what comes next. It only records what has already come. This is the move that most people miss when they look honestly at their results. They look, they see the pattern, they feel the weight of its consistency, and they conclude that the pattern is permanent. That its persistence across years and circumstances is evidence of something fixed about them, something that does not change regardless of what they try. That conclusion is itself an assumption, and it is arguably the most dangerous one, because it takes the receipt, which is simply a record, and promotes it to a sentence, a verdict, a declaration of what is possible for this particular person in this particular life. A sentence forecloses, a receipt simply records. The difference between those two readings of your current reality is the difference between a life that repeats and a life that changes. Let me be precise about what the receipt is actually recording. It is not recording your effort. You may have worked very hard. The receipt does not measure effort. It is not recording your intentions. You may have wanted something better for a long time. The receipt does not measure wanting. It is not recording your potential. You may be capable of far more than your current results suggest. The receipt has no access to potential. It records one thing only: the assumption that was dominant, not in your conscious mind, but at the level of identity, during the period that produced these results. That is the only variable it tracks, which means that when you change that variable, genuinely, at the level of identity rather than the level of conscious thought, the receipt changes. Not immediately, not without the lag that exists between a new assumption and its materialization in the physical world. But inevitably, a different assumption produces a different receipt. This is not a promise. It is the logic of the mechanism. There is a particular feature of the receipt that deserves careful attention. It tends to be consistent across domains that seem unrelated. The person who experiences persistent financial struggle often also experiences a particular kind of relational dynamic, one in which they give more than they receive, in which their needs are treated as secondary, in which asking for what they want feels dangerous or shameful. The person who cannot seem to be fully seen in their work often also experiences a particular kind of social invisibility, the sense of being present in a room without quite landing in it, of contributing without being credited, of being liked without being truly known. This cross-domain consistency is not a coincidence. It is the signature of a single underlying assumption expressing itself in multiple arenas. The assumption, "I am not quite enough," does not confine itself to your bank account. It shows up in your relationships, in your professional life, in the way you enter a room, in the requests you don't make, in the boundaries you don't hold, in the version of yourself you offer when you are afraid the full version might be too much. One assumption, many receipts, all consistent. This is actually useful information because it means you are not dealing with multiple separate problems. You are dealing with one source that is expressing through multiple channels. Fix the source. Change the assumption at the identity level, and the expressions begin to shift across all the domains simultaneously. Not all at once, not without the work we will discuss in the chapters ahead, but from a single point of change rather than from 100 separate battles. Reading the receipt honestly requires something most people find genuinely difficult. It requires separating the observation from the verdict. You can look at your financial situation and observe, this is the level my assumptions have authorized up to now. That is a neutral observation. It contains information. It points toward what needs to change. Or you can look at your financial situation and conclude, this is what I deserve. This is the ceiling of what I am worth. This is the limit of what is possible for me. That is a verdict. It contains no information. It points toward nothing except more of the same. The observation opens a door. The verdict locks it. Most people, when they try to look honestly at their results, slide from observation into verdict without noticing the transition. The movement happens in a fraction of a second. The honest look becomes the familiar collapse. The information becomes the sentence, and the receipt is promoted once again to a permanent ruling on what this life will contain. The practice at this stage is simply to notice that transition. To catch the moment, the observation becomes the verdict. To return to the neutral reading. To hold the information as information rather than as conclusion. This is harder than it sounds, because the verdict feels true. It feels like realism. It feels like the honest acknowledgement of what the evidence shows. But realism is not the same as accuracy. The realistic reading of a period of history does not determine the next period. It describes what the previous assumptions produced. Nothing more. There is one more dimension of the receipt worth examining. Some of what your current reality contains is not the expression of your deepest assumptions. Some of it is the expression of other people's assumptions, absorbed, inherited, mistaken for your own. This is particularly true for the assumptions formed earliest in the environment you did not choose, around the people whose beliefs about the world and about you shaped your sense of what was normal before you had any framework for evaluation. A child who grows up inside the assumption that money is scarce, that effort is never quite rewarded, that security is always provisional, absorbs that assumption the way they absorb language, without examination, without consent, as simply the texture of the world. And then they carry it forward, into circumstances far removed from the original environment, into a life that has none of the original conditions, into opportunities that the original assumption cannot recognize as opportunities because it was formed in a context where such things did not exist. You may be living inside an assumption that was never yours. You may be carrying a receipt for a transaction someone else made. This is worth sitting with quietly, not as an excuse, not as a place to deposit blame for your circumstances, as information. Because an assumption you inherited is no different mechanically from an assumption you formed yourself. It operates the same way. It produces the same results. It requires the same change. But knowing where it came from can dissolve some of the weight of it, can make it slightly easier to hold it at a distance, to see it as something that arrived in you from outside, rather than something that emerged from inside as a fundamental truth about your nature. It arrived. That means it was never permanently installed, which means it can leave. This cross-domain consistency is not a coincidence. It is the signature of a single underlying assumption expressing itself in multiple arenas. The assumption, "I am not quite enough," does not confine itself to your bank account. It shows up in your relationships, in your professional life, in the way you enter a room, in the requests you don't make, in the boundaries you don't hold, in the version of yourself you offer when you are afraid the full version might be too much. One assumption, many receipts, all consistent. This is actually useful information because it means you are not dealing with multiple separate problems. You are dealing with one source that is expressing through multiple channels. Fix the source. Change the assumption at the identity level, and the expressions begin to shift across all the domains simultaneously. Not all at once, not without the work we will discuss in the chapters ahead, but from a single point of change rather than from 100 separate battles. Reading the receipt honestly requires something most people find genuinely difficult. It requires separating the observation from the verdict. You can look at your financial situation and observe, this is the level my assumptions have authorized up to now. That is a neutral observation. It contains information. It points toward what needs to change. Or you can look at your financial situation and conclude, this is what I deserve. This is the ceiling of what I am worth. This is the limit of what is possible for me. That is a verdict. It contains no information. It points toward nothing except more of the same. The observation opens a door. The verdict locks it. Most people, when they try to look honestly at their results, slide from observation into verdict without noticing the transition. The movement happens in a fraction of a second. The honest look becomes the familiar collapse. The information becomes the sentence, and the receipt is promoted once again to a permanent ruling on what this life will contain. The practice at this stage is simply to notice that transition, to catch the moment the observation becomes the verdict, to return to the neutral reading, to hold the information as information rather than as conclusion. This is harder than it sounds, because the verdict feels true. It feels like realism. It feels like the honest acknowledgement of what the evidence shows. But realism is not the same as accuracy. The realistic reading of a period of history does not determine the next period. It describes what the previous assumptions produced, nothing more. There is one more dimension of the receipt worth examining. Some of what your current reality contains is not the expression of your deepest assumptions. Some of it is the expression of other people's assumptions, absorbed, inherited, mistaken for your own. This is particularly true for the assumptions formed earliest in the environment you did not choose, around the people whose beliefs about the world and about you shaped your sense of what was normal before you had any framework for evaluation. A child who grows up inside the assumption that money is scarce, that effort is never quite rewarded, that security is always provisional, absorbs that assumption the way they absorb language, without examination, without consent, as simply the texture of the world. And then they carry it forward, into circumstances far removed from the original environment, into a life that has none of the original conditions, into opportunities that the original assumption cannot recognize as opportunities because it was formed in a context where such things did not exist. You may be living inside an assumption that was never yours. You may be carrying a receipt for a transaction someone else made. This is worth sitting with quietly, not as an excuse, not as a place to deposit blame for your circumstances, as information. Because an assumption you inherited is no different mechanically from an assumption you formed yourself. It operates the same way. It produces the same results. It requires the same change. But knowing where it came from can dissolve some of the weight of it, can make it slightly easier to hold it at a distance, to see it as something that arrived in you from outside, rather than something that emerged from inside as a fundamental truth about your nature. It arrived. That means it was never permanently installed, which means it can leave. Chapter 3. The script running underneath. Every person is living inside a story. Not the story they tell at dinner parties, not the story they post about, not even the story they tell themselves when they are feeling generous and optimistic about who they are and where they are going. A deeper story, one that was written so early and revised so quietly and confirmed so consistently by the events that followed that it stopped feeling like a story at all. It feels like a biography, like just the facts of a life, like the honest account of what a person who knows themselves well would offer if asked to describe their experience with real accuracy. It is not a biography, it is a script. And the difference between those two things is the most important distinction this audiobook will make. Biography records what happened. A script determines what happens next. Biography is passive. It is the accumulation of events shaped by circumstance, by chance, by the choices of others as much as your own. A script is active. It selects, from the infinite range of what could happen, the experiences that confirm what it already believes. It filters the available reality until what remains matches the story it was written to tell. When you look at your life and see a pattern, the same kind of relationship recurring, the same financial ceiling reasserting itself, the same moment of almost, followed by the familiar retreat, You are not looking at biography. You are looking at a script in performance. The characters change. The circumstances shift. The specific events arrive in different forms, different years, and different contexts. The plot stays the same, because the script stays the same. How does a script form? Not through a single dramatic moment, though sometimes a single dramatic moment becomes the anchor for one. A script forms through interpretation. Something happens. You are young, or you are in a vulnerable moment, or you are simply in a situation you don't yet have the framework to understand. And you interpret it. You make meaning from it. You reach a conclusion, not consciously, not deliberately, but the way all living things reach conclusions. By pattern recognition, by emotional imprinting, by the mind's need to make the unknown known. The conclusion might be, when I need something, people don't come. Or, when I show too much of myself, it costs me something. Or, the things I want most are the things I am least likely to get. Or, effort doesn't protect you. Things fall apart regardless. The conclusion lodges somewhere beneath conscious thought. And then, because the mind is always looking for confirmation of what it already believes, it begins to find evidence. Not inventing evidence, finding it, selecting it from the genuine complexity of a life and bringing it forward as a representative, as typical, as proof. And each piece of evidence thickens the script, makes it heavier, more real, more undeniable, until the script is so dense with confirmation that questioning it feels not like courage, but like delusion. The script has several components, and it helps to understand each one separately. Not because they operate separately, but because naming them gives you somewhere to look when you are trying to read your own. The first component is the central statement. This is the core conclusion, the sentence at the bottom of everything. It is almost always a statement about identity, combined with a statement about what that identity is permitted to receive. I am the kind of person who works hard and still ends up behind. I am the kind of person people appreciate but don't prioritize. I am the kind of person who gets close to what they want and then loses it. I am the kind of person whose needs are always slightly too much. I am the kind of person who is fine, but never quite more than fine. You will recognize yours, not because it sounds dramatic, but because it sounds obvious. Because it sounds like something you would never think to question. Because it sounds like a description rather than a story. That is the tell. The central statement always sounds like a description. It is always a story. The second component is the evidence archive. This is the collection of memories, specific, sensory, emotionally vivid, that the script has assembled as its proof. The moment someone chose someone else over you, in circumstances that felt defining. The attempt you made that failed at the exact moment it mattered most. The time you were honest about what you wanted, and it was used against you, or ignored, or met with a response that confirmed you were asking for too much. The period of genuine effort that produced nothing, or worse, produced something and then had it taken back. These memories do not feel like a collection. They feel like reality. They feel like the representative sample of what a life like yours tends to contain. The script selected them, from a life that also contained other moments, kindness, progress, moments where things worked, evidence of capacity and warmth and genuine connection. The script passed over those and archived these. Not because the difficult moments were more numerous, because they were more confirming. The third component is the behavioral code. This is the set of unwritten rules the script has generated for how to navigate a world that operates according to its central statement. If the central statement is, I am the kind of person whose needs are too much, the behavioral code might include, don't ask directly, make yourself useful so your presence is justified, monitor constantly for signs of burden, shrink before you are asked to. If the central statement is, I am the kind of person who gets close and then loses it, The behavioral code might include: don't get too attached, manage expectations downward, find the flaw early so the disappointment arrives on your terms. Keep one part of yourself withheld so the loss, when it comes, isn't total. If the central statement is, I am the kind of person who works hard and still ends up behind, the behavioral code might include: work more, rest less, treat comfort as dangerous, treat success as temporary, spend the good periods bracing for the correction that is surely coming. You follow this code automatically. It does not feel like a code. It feels like wisdom, like the reasonable, experienced response of someone who has learned how things tend to go. It is the script, managing your behavior to produce the results it was written to confirm. The fourth component is the tolerance threshold. This is perhaps the most subtle and the most powerful in terms of its effect on daily experience. The tolerance threshold is the level of goodness that the script will permit before it begins generating resistance. Every script has a ceiling on positive experience, not an absolute ceiling. Things can be good for a while within the range the script considers normal. But when something arrives that exceeds that range, an opportunity significantly larger than usual, a relationship significantly healthier than usual, a financial development significantly more abundant than usual, the script activates, not through thought, through feeling, through a sudden, sourceless anxiety, a sense that something is wrong even when nothing is wrong, an impulse to find the problem, identify the risk, and locate the reason this cannot be as good as it appears. Or through behavior, through the unconscious sabotage that arrives just as something is working, the conversation that derails the relationship at the wrong moment, the decision that undercuts the professional opportunity, the spending pattern that corrects the financial expansion back down toward familiar territory. The script is not malicious. It is simply maintaining homeostasis, returning the experience to the level it considers normal, the level that matches the central statement, the level where prediction is possible, and the familiar sense of home is maintained. Understanding the tolerance threshold is essential, because it explains something that confuses almost everyone who works with this material. Why do good things that arrive not stay? It is not bad luck. It is not the universe testing you. It is not that you don't deserve what arrived. It is the script correcting back to its set point. And the set point only changes when the central statement changes. Now comes the question that matters. How do you read your own script? Not the version you construct when you are trying to think positively, not the version you would offer to someone who asked how you see yourself. The actual running script. The one that is operating right now, beneath this moment of reflection, shaping what feels possible and what feels like wishful thinking. There are several places to look. Look at your recurring experiences, not the occasional difficult moment. Every life contains those. The experiences that repeat, the pattern that has shown up across different relationships, different jobs, different cities, and different attempts to change, where the specific details differ, but the essential shape stays the same. That shape is the script in performance. Look at what you brace for, the thing you are always half expecting, even in good moments. The loss you are waiting for, the withdrawal you assume is coming, the correction that will arrive to balance any period of ease. What you brace for is what the script believes is inevitable. Look at what you explain away, the evidence of your own capability that you dismiss as luck, the warmth offered to you that you reinterpret as politeness, the opportunity that presents itself and that you immediately surround with reasons it probably won't work out. What you explain away is what the script cannot afford to believe. Look at where you stop, not where life stops you. Where do you stop yourself? The sentence you don't finish, the request you almost make and then pull back from. The version of yourself you offer when a larger version was available. Where you stop is where the script has drawn its line. And look, most directly, at the sentence you return to. In your quietest moments, in the moments after something doesn't work out, in the moments when you are being honest with yourself, in the way you are rarely honest with anyone else. The sentence that arrives then, not the dramatic version, not the catastrophic version, the tired, familiar, almost reasonable version. This is just how it tends to go for me. I don't know why I expected something different. Maybe this is just what my life is. That sentence, that specific, worn, almost comfortable resignation. That is the central statement of your script, and it is worth writing down, exactly as it arrives, without softening it, without contextualizing it, without immediately rushing to counter it with something more hopeful. Just write it, look at it, let it be seen. Because a script that is seen is a script that has lost its primary advantage. Its primary advantage was invisibility. It operated as the water you swam in, present everywhere, questioned nowhere, mistaken at every moment for simply the nature of things. When you name it, it separates from you slightly. It becomes a thing you can observe rather than a ground you stand on without knowing it. It does not disappear, not immediately, not through naming alone, but it becomes workable, and workable is the beginning of everything. There is something Neville said that is worth sitting with here. He said, "The man who is not conscious of his inner talking is in the position of one who does not know he is broadcasting." He was pointing at exactly this. Most people are broadcasting constantly, sending out through their assumptions and their inner narrative and their automatic way of inhabiting themselves a signal that is precise, consistent, and powerful. They just don't know they're doing it. They think their outer life is happening to them. They do not see it as a transmission. They do not recognize the signal they are sending or the reality it is constructing. Reading your script is the act of finally sitting down at the broadcast equipment and understanding what you have been transmitting. Not to feel guilty about it, not to perform shock at how consistent it has been, simply to know. Because you cannot change a broadcast you cannot hear. In the next chapter, we will do the most important thing this audiobook will ask of you. Not the most difficult, the most important. We will choose a new assumption, not from wishful thinking, not by picking the grandest possible version of what you want and deciding to believe it despite everything your experience has told you. From the only place a genuine new assumption can be chosen. From the quiet, clear recognition of what the old assumption has been, combined with the equally clear recognition that it was never a fact. It was always a story. And stories, unlike facts, can be rewritten. Chapter 4. How to choose a new assumption. This is the moment most people get wrong, not because they lack sincerity, not because they don't want the change badly enough, not because the law doesn't work, because they choose from the wrong place. They look at what they want, the financial number, the relationship, the level of recognition, the quality of life, and they reverse engineer an assumption that would produce it. They decide they will now believe they are abundant, loved, successful, worthy. They say the sentences, they write them down, they repeat them with intention. And underneath all of it, something older and heavier sits completely unmoved, watching, waiting for the performance to end so it can get back to work. Choosing a new assumption is not a performance. It is not the selection of a preferred belief from a menu of options. It is not the decision to think differently about yourself while the deeper layer of you remains unchanged. It is something more precise than that, and something, in a way, more modest. Because the mistake almost everyone makes when they attempt this is scale. They try to move from one end of the spectrum to the other in a single act of decision. From, "I am the kind of person who always ends up behind," to, "I am abundant, and money flows to me effortlessly." From, "I am the kind of person people eventually leave," to, "I am deeply loved, and my relationships are fulfilling and secure." The distance between those statements is not just conceptual, it is felt. The body knows the distance. The nervous system registers it. And the gap between where you actually live and where you are trying to arrive produces not conviction, but a particular kind of inner dissonance, a sense of pretending that is so uncomfortable, so transparent to your own deeper knowing, that the new assumption cannot take root. You cannot plant something in the ground that is actively rejecting it. The ground needs to be prepared. Neville spoke about this in terms of the feeling of the wish fulfilled. He was not talking about forcing yourself to feel excited about something you don't yet believe. He was talking about something quieter and more specific. The feeling that exists inside the state you want to occupy. The emotional texture of a life lived from a different assumption. Not the peak moments of that life, the ordinary moments. The way a person who genuinely assumes they are financially secure feels while paying a bill. Not relieved, not tense, not performing gratitude, simply fine, matter of fact. The way you feel when you pay for something you know you can afford. The way a person who genuinely assumes they are loved feels when someone they care about doesn't respond immediately. Not anxious, not scanning for meaning, not constructing narratives, simply at ease. Trusting the ordinary rhythms of another person's life without making them a referendum on your worth. That texture, that ordinary, unperformed, unremarkable feeling of someone for whom the assumption is simply true. That is what you are choosing, not the dramatic version, the ordinary version. So, how do you actually do this? The first step is the most counterintuitive. You do not begin by choosing what you want to assume. You begin by fully acknowledging what you currently assume. Not to reinforce it, not to wallow in it, not to spend another hour confirming how deeply the old story runs. To complete it, because an assumption that has not been fully acknowledged has a particular kind of grip. It operates in the half-light, not quite seen, not quite hidden, present enough to govern your experience, obscured enough to resist examination. Full acknowledgement brings it into the open. You say, internally or on paper, wherever you can be most honest, here is what I have been assuming. Here is the central statement. Here is what I have taken for years or decades to be simply true about the kind of person I am and the kind of life I lead. You say it without softening, without the qualifying clause that makes it less stark, without the immediate following, but I know that's not really true, that rushes to rescue you from the discomfort of the full weight of it. You let it sit, acknowledged, complete, seen. This act alone shifts something, not dramatically, but genuinely, because the assumption, once fully named, stops being the water you swim in. It becomes an object, something you can look at rather than something you are perpetually looking through, and an object can be set down. The second step is to question its status, not its content, whether the events it is based on actually happened, whether the evidence it has assembled is real. Most of it is real. The events occurred. The pattern exists. The evidence is genuine. Question its status. Is this a fact, a fixed, permanent, structural feature of reality that cannot be otherwise? Or is this a conclusion, a meaning assigned to events, reasonable given the information available at the time, but assigned nonetheless? Chosen, interpretive, rather than definitive. The distinction matters enormously. Facts are unchangeable. You cannot decide that gravity works differently. You cannot assume your way out of the laws of physics. Conclusions can be revised. Interpretations can be updated. Meanings assigned in one context can be reassigned in another. Not dishonestly, not through denial of what happened, but through the recognition that what happened does not carry its meaning built in. The meaning was added by you, in a moment of interpretation that felt like perception, but was, in fact, creation. The child who concluded from early experience that their needs were too much was not lying. They were interpreting, accurately, the signals available to them in that environment. But the conclusion was not delivered with the events. it was constructed around them, which means it can be reconstructed, not erased, not pretended away. Reconstructed, given a different meaning that is equally honest, equally supportable, and radically more useful. The third step is to choose the adjacent assumption, not the opposite, the adjacent. This is the key technical point that most treatments of this material miss entirely. The opposite of "I am the kind of person who always ends up behind" is something like "I am abundant and prosperous, and money flows easily into my life." And that opposite is too far. The nervous system cannot reach it from where you are. The gap produces dissonance rather than conviction. The new assumption cannot be inhabited because it is too unfamiliar to feel like anything other than a script you are reading. The adjacent assumption is different. It is one step away from where you are, close enough to be believable, genuinely believable, not performatively believable, far enough to represent real movement. "I am the kind of person who always ends up behind" might become "I am the kind of person who is learning what financial stability actually requires, and finding I am more capable of it than I assumed." Or even simpler, "I am the kind of person for whom things are beginning to work out for. Not everything always works out for me." Not, "I am abundant beyond measure. Things are beginning to work out for me." That sentence has movement in it. It acknowledges where you are without being imprisoned by it. It points towards something without demanding that you pretend you are already there. And crucially, it is believable. The nervous system can inhabit it without immediate rejection. That believability is not a compromise, it is the mechanism. Because a new assumption only begins to generate new results when it can be genuinely inhabited, when it can be felt, not just recited, when the body can settle into it, even briefly, rather than simply performing it while something older objects underneath. The adjacent assumption is the one you can actually live in. And a new assumption you can live in, even imperfectly, will outperform a grand assumption you can only perform. There is a question worth asking when you are identifying your adjacent assumption. Not, "What do I want?" That question points toward the destination. It is useful eventually, but it is the wrong starting point because it orients you toward what you lack rather than toward who you are becoming. The question that locates the adjacent assumption is different. Who would I be if the central statement of my script was simply not true? Not, who would I be if the opposite were true? That is still too far, still oriented around reversal rather than release. Who would I be if the central statement simply weren't there? If I had not concluded, somewhere along the way, that I am the kind of person whose needs are too much, who would I be in a conversation where I wanted something from someone I trusted? Probably not fearless, probably not perfectly comfortable, but not braced, not pre-apologizing, not managing the other person's potential disappointment before it arrives. Simply present, asking, willing to hear whatever comes back without having already decided what it means about my worth. That person, that slightly unburdened, slightly more present version of you, is the adjacent assumption made visible. That is who you are choosing to be. The fourth step is to give the new assumption a body. This is where most people stop too soon. They identify the new assumption. They feel, briefly, the opening it represents, and then they leave it as a thought. A better thought than the one before, a more useful orientation, a direction they intend to move in. And a thought without a body fades. It does not take root because it has no physical anchor, no sensory memory, no moment of actual lived experience to which the nervous system can return. Giving the new assumption a body means finding, or constructing in imagination, a specific, concrete, sensory moment that belongs to the person who holds this assumption naturally. Not a fantasy, a moment. The specific feeling in your body when you sit across from someone who genuinely wants to hear what you think, and you simply speak, without editing, without monitoring, without bracing. The specific sensation of looking at your financial situation and feeling not the familiar tightening, but something quieter. The ordinary steadiness of someone who knows things are being handled. The specific experience of your work being received, not celebrated, not praised extravagantly, simply received, with the attention it deserves. Concrete, sensory, small enough to be real. That moment is the seed of the new assumption's physical existence. And in the next chapter, we will work with that moment directly, through the practice of imagination that Neville placed at the center of everything. But before we go there, one more thing needs to be said about choosing. Because choosing a new assumption is not a single event. It is a practice. You will choose the new assumption today and mean it fully. And then something will happen. A specific piece of evidence from the old world, a bill, a silence, a moment of rejection or disappointment, and the old assumption will reassert itself with the full weight of its evidence archive, with the full authority of everything it has spent years collecting, and you will feel the pullback. This is not failure. This is the nature of changing something that lives at the level of identity rather than thought. Thoughts can be changed in an afternoon. Identity changes through repetition, through accumulated experience, through the slow accumulation of moments in which the new assumption was chosen, again and again and again, until it begins to feel less like a decision and more like simply where you live. The choosing is the practice, not the choosing once in a moment of clarity and genuine intention. Returning to the choosing, after the slip, after the pullback, after the day when the old script ran the whole show and you didn't catch it until evening. You return, you choose again, not dramatically, not with the renewed intensity of someone who has decided this time will be different, quietly. The way you return to a breath in meditation, without making the wandering wrong, without requiring the return to be perfect. You simply choose again. And each time you do, the new assumption gains a little more ground. Not because the old one is being defeated, because the new one is becoming more familiar. And familiarity, as we established in Chapter 1, is what the nervous system calls home. You are building a new home. One act of choosing at a time. Chapter 5. Imagination as rehearsal, not escape. There is a version of imagination you already know. The version that arrives uninvited at 2 in the morning. The version that replays the conversation you should have handled differently, or constructs in vivid detail the way a feared thing might unfold, or builds an entire future scenario around a single piece of ambiguous information, a delayed message, an unexpected expense, a look on someone's face that you couldn't quite read. That version of imagination is extraordinarily powerful. You have never doubted its power. You have felt it in your body. The physical response to a scenario that exists only in your mind, the tightening in the chest, the shallowing of the breath, the cortisol moving through you, as though the thing imagined were the thing happening. Your nervous system does not distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. You already know this. You have been living with the consequences of it your entire life. The question Neville's work forces is a simple one. If that version of imagination, the uninvited, fearful, often unconscious version, is powerful enough to produce real physical responses, real behavioral shifts, real changes in how you move through the world, what happens when you use the same faculty deliberately? What happens when you bring the same vividness, the same specificity, the same sensory precision to an imagined experience that belongs to the life you are choosing rather than the life you are afraid of? That is the question imagination as rehearsal answers. First, it is necessary to clear away what imagination is not in the context of this practice, because the misconceptions are significant enough to make the whole thing fail before it begins. Imagination as rehearsal is not visualization in the way the word is commonly used. It is not the creation of a mental movie in which you watch yourself from the outside, as though from a camera, living the life you want. That external perspective, however vivid, does not produce the felt sense the practice requires. You are watching a character. You are not inhabiting one. It is not the construction of grand, cinematic scenarios involving private jets, enormous houses, and adoring crowds. Those scenarios carry a particular energy, the energy of wanting, of lack, of the distance between where you are and where you wish you were. And want, as Neville was precise about pointing out, confirms absence. The feeling of wanting something is the feeling of not having it. And that feeling, held consistently in imagination, produces more of what generates it, more not having. It is not positive thinking with pictures. It is not an affirmation with sensory detail. It is not a technique you perform for 20 minutes and then set aside while the rest of your day runs on the old assumption. It is something more fundamental than any of those things. Neville called it living in the end. The end, in his teaching, is not the peak moment, the dramatic arrival, the celebration, the visible proof that everything has changed. The end is the ordinary state of someone for whom the thing is simply true. The end is not the moment you receive the call that changes everything. The end is a Tuesday morning 3 months later, when you are living inside the new reality, and it has already become normal. That Tuesday morning, that specific, unremarkable sensory experience of a life in which the new assumption is simply the ground. That is where the imagination practice lives, not in the dramatic moment, in the ordinary one. Because the ordinary one is sustainable, the ordinary one can be returned to consistently, without the escalating emotional effort that peak moments require. The ordinary one carries the feeling that Neville identified as essential, not excitement, not relief, not triumph. Normalcy, the quiet, settled, unremarkable feeling of someone for whom this is simply how things are. Let me be specific about what the practice actually involves. You choose a scene. One scene. Not a sequence of scenes, not a narrative arc. A single, specific moment that could only exist inside the life built by the new assumption you have chosen. It needs to be small enough to be real, a brief conversation, a quiet moment alone, a specific physical sensation, something you could hold in your mind for 60 seconds without it requiring narrative support, without needing a before and after to make sense of it. If your new assumption is, I am the kind of person things work out for, the scene might be a moment at the end of a day where something went unexpectedly right, and you sit with a cup of something warm, and the feeling in your body is not the familiar relief of someone who doesn't expect good things and is surprised by them. It is the simpler feeling of someone who expected things to work out, and they did. And this is ordinary. That feeling, that specific quality of ordinary expectation is confirmed. Not dramatic, not emotional, just, of course. If your new assumption is, I am the kind of person whose work is received with genuine respect, the scene might be a moment after a conversation in which you said something and the person across from you paused, genuinely, before responding. Not out of politeness, out of actual engagement with what you said. The pause that means your words landed. You don't need to construct what happens next. You don't need the scene to resolve into praise or visible success. The pause is enough. The specific, felt experience of being genuinely heard. If your new assumption is, I am the kind of person money stays with, the scene might be a moment of looking at a number and feeling nothing alarming. Not pride, not relief, not the performance of gratitude, just the absence of the familiar tightening. The ordinary neutrality of someone who is not braced for financial bad news because they do not assume it is always coming. The absence of tension. That absence is the scene. Once you have the scene, you enter it. Not from the outside, from the inside. You are not watching yourself in this moment, you are in it. You are feeling what your body would feel. You are seeing what your eyes would see. Not a panoramic view, not a cinematic establishing shot, but the specific, limited, first-person view of someone actually inhabiting a moment. What is in front of you, what your hands are doing, what the light is like, what sounds are present or absent, what temperature of the air is. The more specific the sensory detail, the more the nervous system registers this as real experience rather than as mental exercise. And it is real experience, in the only sense that matters to the part of you that generates assumptions. The part that does not distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is physically occurring. The part that responds to the felt sense of a thing, regardless of its source. You hold the scene, not for 20 minutes, not until some feeling of completion arrives. For as long as it remains vivid and felt, which in the beginning may be 30 seconds, maybe a minute, that is enough. You are not trying to sustain an emotional peak. You are making a deposit, a brief, specific, sensory deposit into the nervous system's understanding of what is normal for you. Each time you return to the scene, the deposit compounds, not linearly, not predictably, but cumulatively. The scene becomes more accessible. The feeling it carries becomes easier to find. The new assumption it belongs to begins, slowly and genuinely, to feel less like a choice you are making and more like a place you recognize. There is a quality Neville returned to again and again in his lectures that is worth dwelling on. He called it the feeling of a wish fulfilled, and the word he used most often to describe it was satisfied. Not happy, not excited, not grateful in the performative way gratitude is often practiced. Satisfied. The specific feeling of someone who wanted something and has it, and is now simply living with it, in the way you live with anything that is genuinely yours. Without the effortful appreciation of someone who knows they might lose it, without the performed contentment of someone who is trying to feel a way they don't quite feel. The relaxed, unannounced, unremarkable satisfaction of someone for whom this is simply the texture of life now. That quality, satisfied, is the target feeling of the imagination practice, not as a peak to reach, as a ground to settle into, even briefly, even imperfectly, even for 30 seconds before the mind wanders back to the ordinary concerns of the day. Those 30 seconds are doing something. They are showing the nervous system a different normal. And the nervous system, once shown something enough times, begins to expect it. And expectation, quiet, settled, unremarkable expectation, is the assumption operating at its most powerful. Now, a practical question needs to be addressed. When do you do this? Neville was specific about 2 moments he considered particularly powerful for the imagination practice. The first is the hypnagogic state, the threshold between waking and sleep, when the conscious mind has begun to loosen its grip and the deeper layers of the psyche are more accessible. The moment just before you fall asleep, when thoughts become slightly strange and the boundary between imagination and experience becomes genuinely porous. In that state, the scene you hold does not feel like a mental exercise. It feels closer to experience. The nervous system is already shifting into a mode where the distinction between imagined and real is less firmly maintained. And what you plant in that state goes into deeper ground than what you plant in full waking consciousness. This does not require a formal practice. It requires only that the last deliberate direction you give your imagination before sleep is the scene you have chosen. Not a list of affirmations, not a review of the day. The scene. The specific, sensory, first-person moment of ordinary life inside the new assumption. Let that be the last thing the mind holds before it lets go. The second moment Neville identified is just after waking, before the full agenda of the day has assembled itself, before the inbox has been checked, before the accumulated weight of current reality has re-established its claim on your attention. In those first minutes, the mind is still relatively open, still in the vicinity of the looseness that sleep produces. And a few minutes in the scene, before the day begins, insisting on what it needs from you, anchors the new assumption at the beginning of the waking state, rather than leaving it to be crowded out entirely by everything that follows. These two threshold moments are not the only times the practice is useful, but they are the times when it is most powerful. And if you use only those two windows, the last minutes before sleep and the first minutes after wake, there is one more dimension of this practice that needs to be named. What happens when the scene won't come? When you sit down with the intention of inhabiting the moment and the mind refuses to cooperate, sliding instead into the familiar worry, the practical concern, the review of what is not working, the quiet insistence of the old assumption that this is all somewhat pointless. This will happen regularly in the beginning, and the mistake is to treat it as a failure and push harder, to strain toward the feeling, to force the scene, to perform the satisfaction through gritted teeth until it resembles something you can call the practice. That forcing produces nothing useful, and it adds something harmful. The association between this practice and the feeling of effortful, unsuccessful striving, which is exactly the feeling you are trying to change. When the scene won't come, you do something simpler. You find the edge of it, not the full feeling. The edge of the feeling, the faintest available version of the quality you are after. If satisfaction is unavailable, is there a moment in your actual recent experience, however small, however brief, where something worked out ordinarily, where something was simply fine, in the quiet way of things that are genuinely fine and don't require gratitude to be performed about them? Find that. Hold that, even for 20 seconds. That edge is a genuine deposit. It is less than the full scene. It is more than nothing, and it keeps the practice alive during the periods when the old assumption is loud and the new one is quiet. And the honest truth is that you don't quite believe what you are rehearsing. You don't need to believe it fully for it to work. You need to touch it regularly, specifically, with whatever quality of genuine feeling is available on that particular day. The accumulation of those touches, uneven, imperfect, sometimes barely there, is how the nervous system learns a new normal, not through a single perfect session, through the patient, persistent, unglamorous practice of returning. Neville once said something that cuts through all of the complexity this practice can accumulate around itself. He said, "Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and observe how the outer world reshapes itself to match your inner assumption. Not force the feeling, not perform the feeling, not convince yourself of the feeling regardless of what is true. Assume it. The way you assume, without effort or intention, that the floor will hold your weight when you step out of bed in the morning, not because you have verified it, not because you are choosing to believe it, simply because it is the operating assumption of someone who lives in a world where flaws are reliable. That quality of assumption, effortless, unremarkable, simply the ground, is what the imagination practice is building toward. Not in one session, not in 1 week. Over the accumulated experience of a nervous system that has been shown, repeatedly and specifically, what ordinary life inside the new assumption feels like. Until one day, the scene you have been rehearsing stops feeling like a rehearsal and starts feeling like a memory of something that hasn't happened yet, but that the body already knows. And what the body already knows, it begins to move toward, not because you forced it, because it recognizes it as home. Chapter 6. When 3D screams, the opposite. You have been doing the work. Not perfectly, but genuinely, you found the script. You named the central statement. You chose the adjacent assumption, the one close enough to inhabit, far enough to represent real movement. You built the scene. You have been returning to it in the threshold moments, before sleep and after waking, touching the feeling even on the days when it was faint, and the old assumption was loud. And something has shifted. Something quiet and internal, and not yet visible, but real. The kind of shift you can feel in the quality of your thinking, in the way certain old worries have slightly less grip, in the occasional, unexpected moment where the new assumption doesn't feel like something you are choosing, but like something that is simply briefly there. You noticed that it mattered, and then something happened. It always happens, not as punishment, not as the universe testing your resolve in the way spiritual teachers sometimes describe, as though reality were a suspicious authority checking whether you really mean it before agreeing to cooperate. It happens because of physics, because you have been moving in a particular direction for a long time, and momentum is real, and the fact that you have turned the wheel does not instantly relocate the ship. What happens is this: the outer world, which is always running slightly behind the inner one, catches up with where you were, not where you are. It delivers news from the old address. A financial difficulty arises with the specific texture of your old assumption's favorite evidence. A relationship dynamic surfaces that matches, almost precisely, the central statement you thought you were beginning to dissolve. A professional setback lands at exactly the moment you had started to feel some genuine forward movement, as though the timing were designed to be maximally discouraging. And the old script, which has been waiting with considerable patience, says, "There it is, I told you. This is what actually happens. The rest was wishful thinking." This moment, this specific moment, is where most people lose the thread. Not dramatically. Not in a single decision to abandon the practice. Quietly, the scene becomes harder to access. The return becomes less consistent. The new assumption, which had been gaining ground, stops being chosen as often, not because you decided to stop choosing it, but because the old assumption is now so loud and so freshly confirmed that the new one feels thin and unconvincing by comparison. And over the following days, without any single moment of conscious surrender, the old script resumes its normal operations. The wheel drifts back, the ship returns to its old heading, and eventually you look up and realize that you are, more or less, where you started, which the old script archives immediately as further evidence. This is the cycle that keeps most people circling the same territory for years, not because the law doesn't work, because nobody explained what contradictions actually are. A contradiction is not a verdict. This is the single most important thing this chapter will say, and it is worth holding before moving on. A contradiction is not a verdict. It is not the outer world telling you that your new assumption is false, that the practice doesn't work, that you were naive to believe something could change. It carries no such authority. It has no access to what is true about you or what is possible for you. It is a delayed expression of an old pattern. That is all it is. Think about what you are actually dealing with when a contradiction arrives. You have held a particular assumption, let's say, for 15 years. 15 years of the forecast, the filter, the behavioral code, the tolerance threshold. All operating consistently, all generating experiences in alignment with the central statement. That is 15 years of momentum. You have been choosing a new assumption for, let's be generous, 3 weeks. 3 weeks against 15 years. And when the 15 years send another wave, you interpret it as evidence that the 3 weeks have failed. But that is not what is happening. What is happening is that the old momentum is expressing itself, as momentum does, even after the direction has changed. The direction has changed. The momentum has not caught up yet. That is not failure. That is physics. Neville used an image that is worth dwelling on. He spoke of pruning a tree. When you prune a tree, cutting back the growth that has gone in the wrong direction, redirecting the energy toward the shape you intend. The tree does not immediately reflect the pruning. For a period, it still looks largely like the tree it was. The old branches are still there, or their absence is still visible, or the new growth is so small and tentative that the overall shape of the tree has not yet visibly changed. A gardener who understands pruning does not look at the tree 3 days later and conclude the pruning didn't work. They understand that there is a period between the intervention and the visible result, that the change is happening at a level, the root system, the cellular direction of growth, that is not yet legible in the outer form. They tend the tree during that period. They don't re-prune back to the old shape because the new shape hasn't appeared yet. They hold the direction. Your assumptions are the root system. Your outer life is the tree. When you change the root system, the tree does not immediately change shape. There is a period, its length variable, its quality often uncomfortable, in which the outer form still largely reflects the old root direction, while the new one is establishing itself. The contradiction that arises during this period is not the tree telling you the pruning failed. It is the tree still expressing the old root direction while the new one takes hold. Hold the direction. There is something else happening in the moment of contradiction that deserves precise attention. The contradiction is not just an external event. It is an invitation, a very specific invitation. It is asking you, with considerable force and considerable evidence and the full weight of its familiar authority, to return to the old assumption, to interpret the event as confirmation of the central statement, to let the meaning of what just happened be decided by the script that has always decided meaning. And the invitation feels reasonable. It feels like realism. It feels like the mature acknowledgement of what is actually true, rather than what you have been hoping is true. This is the fork in the road. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. In one direction, you accept the invitation. You allow the event to mean what the old script says it means. You let the contradiction be a verdict. The wheel drifts back. The old assumption regains the ground it had been losing. In the other direction, you decline the invitation, not by denying that something difficult happened, not by pretending the event has no weight or that you are unaffected, by refusing to let it decide who you are. Those are different things. You can feel the full impact of a difficult event. Sit with it honestly, let it move through you without performance. And still, at the end of that honest encounter with it, return to the assumption you chose. The event happened. It does not get to write the conclusion. You write the conclusion. Let's be specific about what declining the invitation actually looks like, because the abstract instruction, don't let it pull you back, is not sufficient when the pull is strong and the old script is presenting its evidence with the particular authority of something that feels indisputably true. The first move is to feel it without collapsing into it. This distinction matters. Feeling something fully. The disappointment, the fear, the specific quality of discouragement that arrives when something you are beginning to trust doesn't come through, is not the same as collapsing into the meaning the old script assigns to that feeling. You are allowed to be genuinely affected. The practice does not require you to be unmoved. It does not require a performance of equanimity that is simply suppression with better branding. Feel it. Let the body have its response. Breathe. Give it whatever time it genuinely needs. And then, not immediately, not through force, but as a natural next movement, ask a different question than the one the old script is asking. The old script is asking, what does this mean about me? The new question is, what does this look like from the position of my chosen assumption? If you are genuinely the kind of person things work out for, how does that person interpret a closed door? Not as confirmation that doors close for them specifically, as information that this particular door was not the right one, and that the person thinks work out for is now moving toward the next one, which may be better suited. If you are genuinely the kind of person money stays with, how does that person relate to an unexpected expense? Not as proof that financial security is an illusion for people like them, as a problem to be handled, practically, by someone who has the capacity to handle it, which they assume they do and therefore do. The interpretation is not a denial of the event. It is the refusal to let the event be interpreted by the old assumption. The second move is the re-entry. After you have felt the contradiction and refused to let it write the conclusion, you return to the scene. Not as an escape from what happened, as a reorientation. You are not going into the imagination practice to avoid the reality of the difficult event. You are going there to remind the nervous system, which has just received a significant signal from the old pattern, where it actually lives now. The scene does not need to be vivid. It does not need to carry the full quality of satisfied normalcy that it carries on the better days. It just needs to be visited. A brief, honest return to the sensory moment of the new assumption. Not to overwrite what happened, to keep the thread, because the thread once dropped takes longer to find. And a brief, imperfect return, even when the feeling is faint, even when the old assumption is still loud in the background, keeps the thread in your hand. The third move is the reinterpretation. This is more active than it sounds. It is not positive spinning. It is not the forced reimagining of a bad thing as secretly good. It is the genuine curious inquiry into what the event looks like when it is not being read through the lens of the old script. The job that rejected you, if you are becoming someone whose work is taken seriously, what might that rejection actually represent? not what the old script says it represents, what it might represent to someone who assumes they are moving toward the right fit rather than being perpetually passed over. Maybe it is the specific information that this particular environment was not the one, that the fit was genuinely wrong, and that wrong fit's rejecting you is not the same as the world rejecting you. The person who withdrew, if you are becoming someone who is loved and kept, what might their withdrawal actually contain? Not the familiar story of your unlovability. The honest possibility that this person's capacity for closeness had limits that had nothing to do with your worth. The reinterpretation is not always available immediately. Sometimes the honest answer is, I can't see it yet. The event is too fresh, and the old script is too loud, and I don't have access right now to the view from the new assumption. That is fine. File it. Give it a day or two, and then return to the question with the curiosity of someone who genuinely believes the answer exists. Because the person you are becoming would not accept the old script's reading as final. The fourth move, and this one is often overlooked, is the smallest possible aligned action. After a contradiction, the old script wants stillness. It wants withdrawal. It wants the behavioral confirmation of its interpretation, the not applying, the not reaching out, the not trying, the lying down in front of the closed door instead of walking toward the next one. The smallest possible aligned action is the direct counter to that impulse. Not a grand gesture, not the performance of confidence you don't feel, not the forced positivity of someone who is pretending the event didn't affect them. The smallest action that belongs to the person you have decided to be. Maybe it is sending one message. Maybe it is opening the financial situation you have been avoiding since the difficult thing arrived. Maybe it is saying something honest to someone you trust, from the position of someone who believes they are allowed to need things from people who care about them. Maybe it is simply getting up, making something, moving the body through the day as someone who has not been permanently defeated by what just happened. Small, specific, aligned with the new assumption rather than the old one. That action does something the imagination practice alone cannot do. It puts the new assumption in the body. It gives the nervous system the direct physical experience of someone who lives from a different ground, not in imagination, but in the actual texture of a lived moment. And the nervous system, which is always updating its model of what is normal for this person, registers it, filed, counted, compounded. There is a quality that the people who successfully navigate this stage develop. It is not faith in the traditional sense. It is not the determined belief that things will work out, maintained through sheer will against the evidence. It is something more precise. It is the ability to hold two things at once without needing them to resolve. This is difficult. The mind prefers resolution. It prefers the contradiction to mean something definitive. Either the new assumption is working and this event is a blip, or the new assumption is false and the old one was right all along. The mind wants to know. The practice requires tolerating the not knowing, holding the difficult event as genuinely difficult, not explaining it away, not rushing to the silver lining, and simultaneously holding the new assumption as genuinely chosen, not as proven, not as confirmed by evidence, as chosen. Because that is what it is. It is not yet a fact. It is a direction, a decision about the ground you are building your life from. Regardless of what the current outer form suggests, you can feel the difficulty of the event and still choose the assumption. Those two things do not cancel each other. They coexist. And the ability to let them coexist, to stop requiring the outer world to confirm the inner decision before the inner decision is permitted to stand, is the specific capacity that separates the people who use this material to genuinely change their lives from the people who use it to feel better for a while before the next contradiction pulls them back. One more thing needs to be said about this stage, about what to do when the contradiction is not a single event, but a sustained period, when it is not one difficult thing arriving, but a season of them, when the outer world is not sending occasional waves from the old pattern, but seems to be entirely composed of them, when the receipts keep coming in, and they all say the same thing, and the distance between your inner work and your outer reality feels not like a gap to be bridged, but like a canyon. Those periods are real. They are not evidence that the practice is failing. But that is a hard thing to hold when you are inside one. What Neville said in his more direct moments was simply this: persistence. Not the manic persistence of someone grinding through sheer force of will. The quiet persistence of someone who has understood the mechanism well enough to trust it, even when the results are not yet visible. The gardener does not dig up the seed to check whether it is growing. They continue to tend the conditions. The watering, the light, the protection from what would damage the tender new growth, and they trust the process that they understand well enough to trust. You are tending conditions. The seed is the new assumption. The watering is an imagination practice. The light is the consistent return after each contradiction. The protection is the refusal to let the old script write the meaning of events. Continue tending, not because you can see the growth yet, because you understand what growth requires, and because the alternative, returning to the old assumption, with its familiar receipts and its reliable ceiling and its comfortable sense of home, is something you have already lived. You know what? That costs. Chapter 7. Making the Law Your Way of Life. There is a version of everything you have read in this audiobook that remains a project, something you undertake with intention during a specific period, something you return to when circumstances become difficult enough to motivate the return, something that lives in a folder or a notebook or a saved file, available when needed, set aside when life reasserts its ordinary demands. That version produces occasional results. It does not produce a changed life, because a changed life is not the output of a project. It is the output of a changed person, and a changed person is not someone who applies a different technique at intervals. It is someone for whom the new assumption has become the ground, the unremarkable, unannounced, simply their foundation from which everything else proceeds. That is what this final chapter is about. Not a new technique, not an additional practice to layer over what has come before. The transition from doing this to being this, that transition does not happen through intensity. This is one of the most important things to understand about the long game of this work. The people who approach it with the most force, who commit with the most dramatic intention, who practice with the most effortful consistency in the first weeks, who feel the most powerful initial shift, are often not the ones who are living inside a genuinely changed assumption 6 months later. Because intensity is not the mechanism. Familiarity is, and familiarity is built not through peak experiences, but through ordinary ones, not through the sessions where everything clicks and the feeling is vivid and the new assumption feels completely real, through the sessions where nothing much happens and you return anyway, through the days when the old script is quiet enough that you barely notice it and the new assumption doesn't require any particular effort to maintain, through the weeks that don't feel like progress because progress at the level of identity is largely invisible until it is suddenly undeniable. You are not trying to sustain a transformation. You are trying to normalize one. Normalization happens through a rhythm, not a rigid schedule, not a formal practice with defined durations and required conditions. A rhythm, the kind that fits inside a life already full of other things, that can be maintained through travel and difficulty and the ordinary chaos of days that don't go the way they were planned. The rhythm has 5 movements. They are not sequential steps to be completed in order. They are a loop, a continuous, self-correcting cycle that, once internalized, runs largely without the effortful attention that conscious practice requires. The 5 movements are: notice, decide, imagine, move, return. Not 5 separate practices, 5 aspects of a single ongoing orientation. Notice. The old assumption does not announce its return. It does not arrive with the weight and drama that its significance would seem to warrant. It arrives in the texture of ordinary thought, in the automatic interpretation of a small event, in the emotional tone of a moment that passes quickly, in the words you use when you talk to yourself about what is happening. Of course, this happened. This is just how it goes. I don't know why I expected anything different. These phrases are not dramatic. They are easy to miss, easy to let pass without recognition, filed under realistic self-assessment, rather than identified as the old script reasserting its position. Noticing means developing the specific sensitivity to catch these phrases at the moment of their arrival. Not hours later in reflection, not during a formal review of how the day went, but as they move through you in real time. This sensitivity develops with practice. In the beginning, you will catch the old script after it has already run for an hour, then 20 minutes, then a few minutes. Eventually, in the moment, not because you are monitoring yourself with anxious vigilance, because the new assumption has become familiar enough that the old one feels different from you, slightly foreign, recognizable as a thing that arrived rather than a thing that is simply true. That foreignness is the signal. When something feels like an old habit rather than a current truth, you have developed enough distance from it to notice without drama, without self-criticism for the fact that the old script appeared again, without the spiral of wondering whether you have made any progress at all. If this is still happening, it will always happen, at some level, for a long time. The noticing is the practice, not the elimination. Label it simply. That is the old assumption. That is not a forecast. That is a pattern. And move to the next movement. Decide. On say you have noticed, you choose again. This is not a lengthy process. It does not require sitting down or closing your eyes or entering any particular state of focused intention. It is a single interior movement. Return to the one sentence that belongs to your chosen assumption. I am the kind of person for whom things work out for. Or whatever the specific sentence is that you have identified as the clearest, most inhabitable expression of the new ground you are building from. Ordained sentence, chosen cleanly. Without the effortful insistence of someone who is trying to convince themselves, with the quiet matter-of-factness of someone returning to something they have already decided. The decision has already been made. You are not remaking it each time. You are returning to it. This distinction changes the quality of the choice. Remaking a decision carries the energy of uncertainty, of weighing, of wondering whether this is right. Returning to a decision carries a different energy entirely. The energy of someone who knows where they stand, who has been knocked temporarily off that ground by what just happened, and is now simply stepping back onto it. That is the quality of the decide movement. A return, not a struggle. Imagine. The full imagination practice, the specific scene, the sensory detail, the held quality of satisfied normalcy, does not need to happen at every point in the loop. The brief version does. After you notice and decide, a moment of imagination anchors the decision in felt experience, 30 seconds. The edge of the scene, the faintest available version of what it feels like to be the person you just decided you are, not the full session. The touch. The brief sensory reminder that this assumption has a body, that it is not just a sentence you are saying but an experience that exists, has been rehearsed, and can be found even in a short moment of deliberate return. The touch keeps the new assumption from being purely cognitive, because a purely cognitive assumption, one that lives only in the layer of conscious thought, without any sensory or emotional embodiment, does not generate results. It generates ideas about results. The imagination touch gives it flesh, even briefly, even imperfectly, even when it is more intention than feeling. The intention consistently applied becomes the feeling over time move. The imagination practice, as powerful as it is, operates in the interior world. The outer world requires something additional. It requires action, not because action alone creates change, but because action is the place where the inner assumption meets outer reality and either confirms itself or reveals that it has not yet fully taken root. There is a question that makes the movement practical and specific. If my chosen assumption were simply true right now, what would I do today that I am not currently doing, or do differently than I am currently doing it? Not this year. Today the answer to that question is almost always available, and it is almost always something modest, something that does not require the outer world to have changed yet, something that belongs to the person you are becoming rather than the person you have been, and that you can do right now from where you are without waiting for circumstances to authorize it. Maybe it is sending the message you have been holding back. Maybe it is making the decision you have been deferring to some future version of yourself who feels more certain. Maybe it is setting a boundary that the old assumption said you did not have the standing to set. Maybe it is investing something, time, money, attention, in a direction that the old assumption said was not realistic for someone like you. Maybe it is asking for something you need from someone who has indicated they are willing to provide it, without the pre-apologizing and minimizing that the old script uses to make the asking feel safe. The action does not need to be large. It needs to be aligned. aligned with the new assumption rather than the old one, moving from the ground of who you have decided you are rather than the ground of who your history says you must remain. Each aligned action is a data point, a moment of physical evidence deposited in your own experience that the new assumption is not just a thought you are thinking, but a way of being you are practicing. And the accumulation of those data points does something that imagination alone cannot fully achieve. It begins to convince the body. The body is persuaded by action in a way it is not always persuaded by even the most vivid imagined experience, because the body lives in the physical world. And when the physical world contains evidence, however small, however ordinary, of a person operating from a different assumption, the body begins to update its model. This is what we do now. This is who we are. Return. Everything in this rhythm eventually arrives at the same place. The return. Not because the other four movements are less important, because the return is what makes them sustainable. You will forget. There will be days, sometimes consecutive days, when the loop simply does not run, when the old assumption operates without noticing that it would interrupt it, when the imagination practice goes unvisited, when the actions you take are driven by the old script, because the new one was not consulted. This will happen. It will happen more often than you expect, more often than you want, more often than is compatible with the idea of a clean, continuous transformation. And the version of this work that requires a clean, continuous transformation will fail, not because you failed, because that requirement was never realistic. The version that survives contact with an actual human life, with its unpredictable demands and its periods of exhaustion and its moments of genuine crisis that crowd out every practice, is the version built around the return, not the unbroken streak, the persistent return. You went back into the old assumption for 3 days. Fine. Notice that. Decide again. Touch the scene. Take one aligned action. Return. You let a week go by without a single moment of deliberate practice. Fine. Return. You had a period, maybe an extended one, where the difficulty of your circumstances made the whole framework feel thin and unconvincing, and the old script felt like the only honest account of your life. That was a real period. It had weight. It cost something. Return. Not with the self-flagellation of someone who has failed, with the simple, practical orientation of someone who knows where they are going and has temporarily been somewhere else. Return. This is the movement that Neville described in different language again and again across decades of teaching. He said, sleep as though it were true. Wake as though it were true. Move through your day as though it were true. Not perfectly. Not without the contradictions and the doubts, and the moments where true feels like a very long way from here. As though. The as though is the return. It is the perpetual, imperfect, stubbornly maintained orientation toward the assumption you have chosen, regardless of what the current outer form suggests, regardless of what the old script says the evidence means, regardless of how many times you have had to return before this particular returning. There is something that happens after enough time with this rhythm that is difficult to describe without making it sound more dramatic than it actually is. The loop begins to run on its own, not perfectly, not without exception, but underneath the ordinary activity of a day, the rhythm that you have been consciously practicing begins to operate below consciousness, the way any deeply repeated pattern eventually operates, the way you no longer think about balance when you walk, even though balance is a complex, continuously adjusted calculation that you once had to learn. You stop noticing the old script because you catch it so quickly it barely lands. You stop making the choosing feel effortful because you have returned to the chosen assumption so many times it has become the familiar ground. You stop requiring the imagination practice to be formal and deliberate because the felt sense of the new assumption is accessible enough that brief contact with it is available in the ordinary flow of a day. You stop tracking whether the aligned actions are working because acting from the new assumption has simply become how you act. The practice becomes the person, and around this time, not at a specific moment, not in a single dramatic revelation, but gradually, across a period that you will later struggle to locate precisely, you will notice that the outer world has been changing, not all at once, not in the cinematic way that transformation is sometimes described, in the way that a life genuinely changes, incrementally, quietly, in ways that individually seem small and possibly coincidental, and only become legible as a pattern when you look back across enough of them, the opportunities that began to arrive that didn't arrive before. Not necessarily enormous ones, often modest ones that match the adjacent assumption rather than the ultimate destination. The relationships began to organize themselves differently. The dynamics that shifted, sometimes through direct change in the people involved, more often through your own changed response to what they offered, which changed what they offered. The financial situation that began to move, slowly, not spectacularly, but in a direction it had not moved before, with a consistency it had not previously had. The inner experience of a day, which is, in some ways, the most significant change of all. The background hum of low-level tension that you had been carrying so long you had stopped knowing it was there. Quieting. The reflexive bracing for disappointment. Softening. The quality of your own company is improving. Because you are no longer living inside the constant friction of an assumption that tells you that who you are is not quite enough for what you want. You are living inside a different assumption, one that is still being built, still being returned to, still being practiced, but real enough now to change the texture of ordinary experience. That texture change is not a side effect. It is the point. Neville spent his life teaching one thing in many different forms. He said, consciousness is the only reality, by which he meant the inner world, the world of assumption and imagination and felt sense and identity, is not a reflection of the outer world. It is the source of it. The outer world is the shadow. The inner world casts it. Most people spend their lives trying to rearrange the shadow while leaving the source unchanged, working harder, acquiring more, changing circumstances, changing locations, changing partners, all in the hope that if enough things in the outer arrangement improve, the inner experience will follow. Sometimes it does, briefly, and then the source reasserts itself. The new circumstances produce familiar receipts, because the assumption was never changed. What you have been doing in this audiobook, reading the script, choosing the adjacent assumption, building the scene, navigating the contradictions, returning again and again to the chosen ground, is not the work of rearranging the shadow. It is the work of changing what casts it. That work is slower than rearranging circumstances. It is less visible in the short term. It is less dramatic than the stories that make the comment sections of manifestation videos, the overnight miracles, the sudden reversals, the checks arriving in the mail days after a visualization session. And it is the only work that actually changes a life. Not one situation, not one outcome, not one receipt, the generator of all the receipts, the person who moves through the world, the assumption at the center of everything. So here, at the end, there are no instructions, no action steps, no summary of techniques, no homework to complete before the work can be considered done. Only this: you have spent this time looking at the mechanism that has been building your experience. You have seen it with enough clarity that it cannot go entirely back to being invisible. You have chosen, at least once, a different ground to stand on. You have touched, at least briefly, the felt sense of what ordinary life looks like from that ground. That is enough to begin, not to complete, not to arrive. To begin. The rest is the rhythm. Notice, decide, imagine, move, return, again and again, not until you get it right. Until it becomes who you are. And one day, not the day you are hoping it will be, probably, because arrival rarely announces itself the way anticipation imagines it will, you will be in the middle of something ordinary, a conversation, a meal, a moment alone with a task you are doing without particular significance. And you will notice, quietly, without fanfare, that you are not braced, that the background tension you carried for so long is simply not there. The old script, when you look for it, feels like something from a long time ago, something that belonged to a different version of you that you can remember clearly and understand with compassion and no longer inhabit. That the assumption you chose, the one that once felt like a sentence you were reading aloud without fully believing, feels like the simple, unremarkable truth of who you are, not because the outer world finally confirmed it, because you held it long enough that it became real. That is the law, lived all the way through, not a technique, not a belief system, a different way of being a person in the world, built quietly and persistently, one return at a time. You were never broken. You were never invisible to life. You were never missing something that other people have and you do not. You were living from an assumption you did not know you had chosen. Now you know. Now you choose.